So I heard that Outler had once said that the most edifying doctrine of hell that he had ever heard of was where it was 1:15 in the afternoon all the time. So that's where they put the speakers to test you. I wanted to mention something that Shirley Mullins had said when she commented that Christian liberal arts is about creating a space for the Holy Spirit to work, for sanctifying work and formational work. And I recalled that in one of my classes, I had one of these epiphany moments where I thought two things are necessary for spiritual formation to occur. One is time, and the other is a kind of consciousness, a coming to awareness. And those two things are things that we don't have in our busy world. It just dawned on me that I'm dealing with students who've got no time and they've got no sense of consciousness because they're always filling them up with other things. And it's true of us also. I mean, it was in the 80s that Nowen wrote in The Way of the Heart, there's a little section on the compulsive minister. And you can see this in Eugene Peterson and other writers about how we should not be busy. And so I want to thank David and Russ and the denomination, what Kim Kraft has done, to give us this space, this place where we can have time, where we can begin to unfold some of this process. This is, Russ said earlier, it's a luxurious privilege. So I just want to thank you for the privilege of being here with you all. I'm going to chop a lot out of my paper, and if you've got the typed copy, you'll be happy about that. You'll be happy about it either way, I guarantee you. Nikos Kazantzakis grew up in a religiously schizophrenic household, raised by an atheist father and a pious Greek Orthodox mother. As a young college man, he embarked on a pilgrimage to Mount Athos Monastery, situated high in a Greek peninsula. There he sought guidance from Father Macarius, a wise old monk. He recounted a conversation that went something like this. Nikos, so Father, you are alone here, and you wrestle with the devil? Macarius, no, the devil and I have fought for years. I have grown old, and so has he. We have made our peace. Nikos, so then your solitude must be pleasant. Macarius, no, for now I wrestle with God. Nikos, you wrestle with God and you hope to win? No! When you wrestle with God, you hope to lose. Kazantzakis' story signifies two stages of the typical spiritual formation journey. During the first half, we build our life, forging our identity through struggle, mapping our theological worldview, discovering our vocation, forming lifelong relational commitments. We wrestle with the devil during this first stage, fighting to bring our affections, our passions, and desires under the control of spiritual disciplines. Like Jacob, we grasp after birthright, blessing, our life's calling, and our soulmate. Like the prodigal, we have to leave home in order to find home. Like Wesley, we form holy clubs to tame our passions, and eventually we have to sail to Georgia in the hopes of saving our souls. In the second half of life, we first fill the container we have built, then gradually learn to let go of our life. Now we wrestle with God, learning the meaning of detachment, of living the cruciform life of sanctification as we give ourselves away in love to God and neighbor, and as we prepare for death. Moving into this second stage successfully normally requires something stopping us in our tracks, as when Jacob stood alone and silent at the brook, wrestling with his past, wrestling with his sins against Esau, wrestling with himself, wrestling with God. Or as when Wesley faced his failures in Georgia. Resolutely at home once more, our temptations now revolve less around prodigal pleasures and more around facing the melancholy and anger of the elder brother within us. It may not be too much of a stretch to suggest that Wesley's own religious biography in some way represents the two halves of spirituality, if not exactly divided by Aldersgate, at least indicating a shift between before and after. in the first half of life, we mostly try to manipulate our spiritual destiny. Like the disciples who cannot fathom the meaning of a crucified Messiah prior to the resurrection, you think of Mark's gospel, how it lays that out, who fasten their own belts and go wherever they wish. In the second half of life, God asks us to embrace a more radical faith where someone else will fasten a belt around us and take us where we do not wish to go. Life unfolds then in more or less two halves corresponding to two different stages of spirituality. At Wesleyan institutions of higher education, we engage students well with first half issues, and I will suggest a particular shape for spiritual formation among young adults during this period. But we sometimes set students up for confusion or failure in the second half of life by unmooring them during college from a vigorous experience of sacramental ecclesial life. Wesleyan higher education today therefore faces the formidable task of guiding young people through the period sociologists are calling emerging adulthood, while concurrently providing them with a foretaste of the deeper paths of transformation still to come. Universities cannot accomplish this twin task, however, without greater connections to local congregations and apart from deeper commitments to the sacramental mystery embedded in the practiced piety of Eucharistic life. This represents the heart of the problem we have gathered to address. Traditionally, Wesleyan universities and seminaries stand better equipped to prepare individuals to face questions arising in the first half of life than in the second. On the one hand, this is natural since the primary age group we teach is journeying through this first stage. And Wesleyan theology stands peculiarly endowed to lead young people along these foundational paths of formation, of wrestling with the devil. I will first explore, therefore, the rich Wesleyan resources available to form college students spiritually. But on the other hand, we have to admit that holiness theology, especially when filtered through modern North American culture, has tended to stress conversion and revival, thus enabling university students to imbibe often an individualistic and self-centered version of Christian formation that leaves them ill-prepared to negotiate deeper spiritual formation later in life. Now, some of this is cultural, obviously, but some of it may have to do with our theological heritage that we need to rethink, reconfigure. It is not overestimating the case to say that any form of spirituality that remains disengaged from congregational life and practice, from Wesley's means of grace, which were originally configured communally, may actually hinder persons from maturing spiritually in the second half of life. Frank Whaling correctly affirms that Wesley's main concern was for spirituality itself, for knowing God in the heart by faith, for practicing the presence of God, for seeking after perfect love. And I think, sanctifying context, what Steve started off the symposium with, you could just say that those are formational contexts. That's what we're talking about. Wesley's theology is formational theology. And although Wesley assumed an ecclesial context for this formation, we easily can identify modern tendencies that undermine the role of the church and community in spirituality. After all, we live in an age where spiritual but not religious rings as a serious slogan. Colleges can unwittingly participate in the trend of making congregational life merely one spiritual option among many. At the outset of our exploration of Wesleyan spirituality as an essentially ecclesial theology, let me assert that our problem is not primarily academic, something to be worked out on paper. It is rather, as we've heard throughout the symposium, an ecclesial problem, one of practice, one that must be lived in communication between colleges and churches in an increasingly individualistic and materialistic culture. First, let me describe the initial phase of spirituality that Wesleyan higher education excels at, what we could call foundational formation. Young people arrive on our colleges, on our campuses, overflowing with grand hopes and dreams, but often in great turmoil, bearing deep emotional and spiritual wounds. As we consider the main contours of emerging adult experience and the various spiritual challenges faced by this age group, we also notice the unique resources Wesleyan theology offers. Ronald Rolheiser expresses well the restlessness of these young adults. Quote, "This stage hits us with a tumult and violence that overthrows our childhood and sends us out restless, sexually driven, full of grandiose dreams, but confused and insecure, in search of a new home, one that we build for ourselves. And this is a time of much longing and searching for an identity, searching for acceptance, searching for a circle of friends, searching for intimacy, searching for someone to marry, searching for a vocation, searching for a career, searching for the right place to live. Sounds tiring, doesn't it? Searching for financial security, and searching for something to give us substance and meaning. In a word, searching for home. The litany Rolheiser presents here sounds familiar to college professors, administrators, and student development staff. His list provides classic themes we target at the university, right? Themes like identity formation, vocation as calling, cultivation of responsible relationships and modes of personal communication, and living the examined life. These sorts of topics lie at the root of the Wesleyan Christian liberal arts agenda as we encourage students to develop a biblical theological worldview. Wesleyan institutions address these matters capably, drawing on the spiritual tools of Wesleyan holiness. Our educational institutions call individuals to repentance and personal responsibility, instructing them in biblical literacy, the biblical theological worldview Steve Lennox describes as the Wesleyan meta-narrative, urging a notion of vocation as holy calling rather than mere occupation, fostering relationships grounded in love of God and neighbor rather than in self-interest, with one's personal identity firmly anchored in reconciliation from sin through divine grace. Wesley's means of grace offer spiritual nourishment and armor then as young adults wrestle with the devil. Even though we have ample resources within our tradition to form students spiritually, we still need to give that formation process a visible shape. So where do we begin? With all the churning desire bursting from the emerging adult population we serve, what Rolheiser calls in a really good book, Holy Longing, it comes as no surprise to discover students committing early to mission trips, to inner-city work with the homeless, or to noble causes for justice and compassion. Young people typically dream of changing the world, and they possess boundless energy. Thus, emerging adults often consider social action as an invigorating path to formation. For Wesley, of course, there was no private religion. "I shall endeavor to show," he announced, "that Christianity," didn't he have a high squeaky voice? I don't know. That Christianity is essentially a social religion, and to turn it into a solitary one is to destroy it. Yeah, I got to try to keep you awake. Okay, next page. If we ask where the contours of formation should begin for emerging adults in a Wesleyan theological setting, of course, initially it begins with repentance and conversion as pardon of sins, with our surrender to God and our adoption as daughters and sons into His kingdom. And I think again of something that Shirley had said, but I was reminded in one of the talks and the conversations afterwards how much formation starts with humility. And how much the academic process in creating a space is an invitation into humility, where one of the first things we have to do is face ourselves. There is no repentance. Phil Connors doesn't change in Groundhog Day until he begins to face himself. That's the greatest spiritual classic of all time. Anyway, but assuming a student has already experienced God's saving grace, they might find it natural to rush headlong into social action. A better place, however, to introduce the process of spiritual formation with young people who are already overly stimulated is with silence and solitude. Wesley urged his followers to notice their condition, to open their eyes. "Repent, that is, know yourselves. Awake, then, thou that sleepest. The eyes of thine understanding are darkened, so they cannot discern God or the things of God." Although contemplative prayer needs to be taught gradually, over time, nevertheless, seasoned practitioners can ease students into the practice of deeper prayer by first raising questions of personal desire, passion, or what Wesley termed the religious affections. The process of spiritual formation might begin then for college students with Jesus' simple queries, "What are you looking for?" or "What do you want me to do for you?" These questions require some inner contemplative work, a movement into silence and solitude that allows self-examination and listening to the Holy Spirit. The implicit question Jesus asks us here is what we most love. For the thing we long for is what we will expend our energy on. As Wesley taught, our actions flow from our desires. The desire of our happiness is inseparably bound to our nature and is the spring which sets all our faculties a-moving. Silence, then, moves us into the relational experience of prayer, where students can receive guidance in centering prayer, the Jesus prayer, practicing the presence of God, other forms of deepening prayer, where habits of prayer might lead students next into approaching Scripture prayerfully through Lectio Divina. The one great office of prayer, urged Wesley, is to produce such a disposition in us to exercise our dependence on God, to increase our desire of the things we ask for, to make us so sensible of our wants that we may never cease wrestling till we have prevailed for the blessing. Is that too distracting? Chesterton said, if you do not have mirth, you will certainly have madness. Okay, so you've got to have some, formation has got to be fun, right? Okay. Wesleyan higher education naturally begins with the shape of emerging adults' desires and affections as they wrestle prayerfully with issues of identity, ultimate meaning, theology, worldview, vocation, this laundry list that Rolheiser gives us, all in connection with the broader ecclesial community. Ultimately, we direct students toward love of God and neighbor, the core of the gospel for Wesley. As Brother Lawrence suggested, our sanctification does not depend on our changing our works, unless you're currently a hitman for the mafia. Then there's an exception. But in doing that for God's sake, what we commonly do for our own. I've often thought about this, though. You know, it's like, I'm a clean hitman, you know, and it's got this like an evangelistic task. You know, I say, okay, sucker, you're going to die, so you got about 30 seconds to pray. It would be something like the sinner's prayer there. Anyway, the Godfather. Yeah, see, I got to talk to the right man here. Okay. Okay. That's right. New meaning to the Godfather. Okay. So it's really our motivation shifts from self-centeredness to putting on the mind of Christ as we approach life-building issues such as our longing for a soulmate or our desire to contribute meaningfully to the kingdom of God's work through our life's work. The broad shape of foundational formation thus moves from inner contemplative love of God. So I'm talking about starting formation here with a serious inward look at the affections, moving into prayer through that, and then coming outward into compassionate love of neighbor in active biblical social justice. So we've got the contemplative life love of God and the active life love of neighbor. What happens often in the formational process, however, is that in identifying our heart's deepest longings, we bump into the core of our own human condition, both as broken and as loved by God. Our deepest human longings are represented in Christ's three temptations. So you tell me if you think I'm right here. The desire for comfort or indulgence, turn these stones to bread. The desire for community or intimacy, dive off the temple and the crowd will respect, if not revere you. And the desire for control or influence, all the kingdoms of the world can be yours. Each of these desires allows legitimate human expressions, both as Satan tempted Jesus, but as we are tempted. Nothing is wrong with meeting basic physical needs, with building committed love relationships, or with wanting to live our lives for a meaning beyond our finite selves. But behind each desire also lurks a shadow, pleasure-seeking indulgence, self-idolizing narcissism, or manipulative power over others. Notice further that opposite each desire, we bump into our greatest human fears, and students really understand this: pain, abandonment, rejection, and utter powerlessness. As the course of spiritual development unfolds within emerging adults, the universal experience of human fear raises an important point regarding formation, our work with them. That is the brokenness of today's youth. They are broken like no generation has ever been broken before. As the Desert Fathers teach us, to move into a posture of stillness, especially for the passionately restless among us, means facing personal demons. And the emerging generation carries deep wounds. What we have to take seriously then is the inner healing work necessary for real transformation. And so we're talking about psychological help with professionals and the role of student development coming alongside of us, because we're not trained in this. I don't think any of us are as faculty, but we need help. If wounds are not addressed, a friend of mine suggested we always lead only out of our wounds. Wounds, therefore, require healing, healing that amounts to deep spiritual transformation. Wesleyan colleges cannot expect to mediate therapeutic grace, however, apart from the church. The question remains then, how might the shape of formation unfold as a communal and ecclesial endeavor within our educational institutions to better prepare students for spiritual growth, continuing into the second half of their lives, especially when we're thinking about sanctification as process? In our Wesleyan educational context, it seems natural for us to draw young people deeper into the formational work of rightly ordering their loves so that they anchor decisions about worldview, vocation, relationships firmly in their love for God. This ordering of loves constitutes a key aspect of inner Wesleyan piety throughout their lives. But emerging adults face drastic cultural changes today, making the role of the church even more important than ever, precisely at the time when many of them are dropping out. Consider some of the significant social shifts emerging adults face. Marriage is being delayed considerably, along with occupational stability, and education is being prolonged almost a decade now as parents continue to invest financially in their children well after graduation from college. This produces an extended period of experimentation with identity, values, and religious commitments among what Robert Wuthnow has recently termed a generation of religious tinkerers. We already know from sociologists about the effects of American individualism. As early as 1985, Bella warned us in Habits of the Heart of the privatization, this individualism in American religion, he termed as Sheilaism. And in Bowling Alone, 2000, Putnam convincingly demonstrates how we're becoming a culture of non-joiners. So this is cultural inheritance, a problem that we are getting as in the air that we breathe. As Sutron and Kiesling conclude, life disruptions, and I'm thinking about emerging adults now, life disruptions tend to correlate negatively with strong religious commitment. In fact, they say that many are arguing that we shouldn't even attempt to form strong religious commitments at this point when students are so fickle that we should wait till they're more serious later on. On the one hand, we need not concede so easily to forces of individualism within the culture that are luring young people from our churches. On the other hand, it may be argued that part of the problem lies within Wesleyan's thin theological ecclesiology. Let me just pause here in a thought experiment, just backing up just a minute, to say the forces of individualism in our culture. I think that we recognize these when you're dealing with ministerial students and you say, is this same problem that we're facing about community, is it a problem in the two-thirds world? It doesn't take them very long to say, no, it's not. And our students are required to go overseas, and so most of them at that point have experienced cross-cultural trips. On the other hand, it may be argued that part of the problem lies with Wesley's ecclesiology. It is true, in contrast to our current individualistic consumer spirituality, that Wesley's commitment to the life of the Anglican Church was simply part of the cultural air he breathed. That's actually part of the problem. He just took it for granted. But because he took the substance of Anglicanism for granted, he had no need to develop an ecclesiology. He consistently viewed Methodism as a renewal movement within the Church of England. He never sets the church up, really. We might ask then whether Wesleyan theology itself, as practical divinity, does not actually encourage ecclesial ambiguity, if not an ecclesial anemia that naturally devolves into individualism. Since Outler posed the question in 1962, Wesleyan scholars have wondered aloud whether indeed Methodists have a doctrine of the church at all. In Guang O's recent study, John Wesley's Ecclesiology, he depicts a legion of ecclesial children who are claiming Wesley as their theological heir. It's mind-boggling how many different forms of ecclesiology are saying we're Wesleyan. For his own ecclesiology, Wesley relied on the position laid out in the Anglican Articles of Religion, while at the same time, and this is important, adapting innovative means to promote the renewal movements in Britain and America as they developed. Ted Campbell, therefore, observes Methodists originated as a religious movement that presupposed existing church structures and only later added elements necessary to configuring themselves as churches, contributing, and that's an end quote right there, but then contributing to what he calls a bipolar understanding of the church. In contrast to Campbell's gloomy assessment, however, It might be argued that Wesley offers just the right balance theologically for the development of a renewed understanding of the church and of participation by our students in ecclesial forms of life while on campus. Wesley held a high view of community. He held a high view of Eucharist. In distinctive ways, Billy Abraham and James Pedler both turn what Campbell considers ecclesial ambiguity into a positive dynamic by suggesting a synthesis between Spirit and Eucharist, between charismatic freedom and institutional structure. Think of liturgical high church worship paired with a Mennonite communal life akin to Bonhoeffer's Finkenwald experiment, all driven by Spirit-infused communion with God. Oh, doesn't that sound like fun? Yeah. Most of us would want to be part of that kind of a church. We could generate on our campuses a spiritual formation more like what Wesley's followers experienced in the bands, or like the kind of evidenced in Life Together or the Benedictine Rule of Life. So I'm coming back to what John had said in his paper. This kind of practiced spirituality is what James K.A. Smith entices us with in Desiring the Kingdom. Smith joins spiritual formation in the first half of life, so the proper ordering of our loves, our desires and our affections, and the practiced ritual patterns necessary for faith in the second half of life. And so I'm not going to read that quote down below. You can read that, but basically he's saying is that we practice, and then we're going to love what we practice. That's going to develop our habits. And so these ritual patterns, how important these are to build into this ecclesial community. He goes on to describe how secular liturgies misform us spiritually, whereas Christian practices, rituals, and liturgies can shape us toward wholeness. Now, before recommending potential theological solutions, I came from the negative table back there. And Joe gave me a charge to really represent our table well. So I want to give the real gloom and doom here first. So before solutions, I think it's important to understand the depth of ecclesial bankruptcy experienced by the current emerging adults. I'm not saying it is bankrupt, but it's what they experience. Because I don't think we're going to have the courage to really act at our institutions like we need to act in league with constituents, in league with congregations and church bodies, unless we realize how desperate the situation is. Now, let me give two contrasting illustrations. 1976, Robert, a drug-using, heavy-drinking 18-year-old, matriculated at Seattle Pacific College merely to play soccer. By the end of his freshman year, he was a religion major. What happened? He was headed towards seminary at that point. The long and the short of it is this was Wesleyan small group formation at its best, where Bible study on the dorm floor happened nightly, where fellow students drug him to chapel and made him memorize hymns, where faculty taught him an articulate biblical theology that he didn't have to worry about destroying his faith, and he knew it could take him into the secular world with confidence. And yet all of that, there was an ecclesial assumption. Not going to church was not an option. Not being involved in ministry was not an option. This was just assumed that holiness was social holiness as much as it was inner holiness of heart, mind, strength, and soul. So he had experienced Wesleyan means of grace mediated through university and church in what James Smith calls worship as the formation of our desires or the education of our desires. Fast forward to another Wesleyan, Free Methodist College, this time Spring Arbor University, in the early 2000s. Melissa, a former student, emailed me from Costa Rica where she'd moved after graduating. "Do you mind," she queried, "if I ask you a few questions about some things I've been struggling with for a while? I have struggled to go to church for the past 2 or 3 years. When I go, I usually leave angry. When I don't go, I feel guilty. The answers that the church gives me don't leave me feeling satisfied, but I'm trying to make peace with the church. Since the majority of Christians find the church to be something helpful and nurturing, I'm beginning to think that the problem might be me. As strange as this is going to sound, I think I might need to start handling the church like I handle avocados. I don't like avocado. In fact, it makes me sick. However, I eat it every chance I get because I like the idea of it, and I want to like it. Every time I eat it, I like it a little more, and it makes me a little less sick. One of the biggest keys was I stopped expecting it to be something I liked. Melissa asks questions here familiar to today's youth. Essentially, she wants to know whether or not the church has anything to offer her, anything that might nourish her soul and her life. Like Melissa, many young Wesleyan evangelicals are expressing dissatisfaction with the institutional church, more often by dropping out of church than by questioning it or by straining to like it with her avocados. Another student astutely commented that his college peers normally chose one of three paths by the time they reached their junior year. They converted to a liturgical tradition, and we've had a lot at Spring Arbor University. They went down a charismatic path, Vineyard or something, or they dropped out altogether. A boundless longing for something deeper stirs in the hearts of our younger generation. A longing for more mystery, for more authentic community, for greater spiritual power, the Holy Spirit, for more complete and more fully integrated human life. We want our avocados to nourish us, but we want to like them too. We want a substantive faith that can endure life's storms of hardship and doubt. What students long to be taught, as Andrew Luth suggested, is how to live the mystery, to know at least partially. This is formation being experienced, to know at least partially even as we have been fully known, to recognize that theology is not merely perception of God, but response to the mystery of God in Christ, a participation in the divine life. Of course, a full-bodied ecclesial spirituality like this is precisely what flowed through the veins of the early Wesleyan movement. Wesley understood means of grace sacramentally and charismatically as spiritually transforming medicines for the sin-sick soul. If we do not expose students more thoroughly to the means of grace practiced communally while they are in college, not only will they find it harder to reconnect to the church later in life, but their spirituality will also likely remain shallow. Thin faith is not going to serve them later on in life when they really have to learn how to let go and face crosses. How should we describe the spirituality experience during the second half of life then? Ronald Rolheiser calls it mature discipleship, and Hageberg and Gulich use the term the productive life, both authors indicating a shift within the individual from sucking energy out of the world to pouring life back into others. So if you think of a maybe not so healthy emerging adult, maybe at 18, coming into a room, it doesn't matter whether they're happy or depressed, they're going to suck the life into their corner. And it's only later that they're going to pour life back into the room. Richard Rohr speaks of the great turnaround, where our focus flips outward in love toward God. Most often there's some crisis that occurs. Spirituality during the second stage means facing ourselves, and I don't think that we do that very easily on our own. Our limits and our finitude. And it's usually something that we don't want to do, and that's why John of the Cross, the Dark Night is something that happens to us. It's not something you would say, oh, I'm going to do a dark night this next year. We can no longer hide from our true selves, declare Nemec and Coombs. We begin to realize that our God has been too small, and we start to recognize everywhere that He is not. As we die to our unrealistic expectations, we learn, in their words, to mistrust what we never should have trusted in the first place. Our previous ways of encountering God prove unsatisfying, and we find ourselves thirsting for more, for something deeper. This is what emerging adults are going to face at some point, connected to the church or not. Quoting Nemec and Coombs, God removes even the possibility of our clinging to anything or anyone other than Himself. Apparently abandoned by all others, we are thus disposed to abandon ourselves more deeply in faith to God Himself. And think of the sanctifying implications of that, of being able to let go. I could almost paraphrase what Billy had said earlier in his talks after Steve's paper about coming to this place where we fully let go. God awakens us to our insatiable longing for union and love with Him, while at the same time we realize everything in this life is provisional and that nothing less than God will satisfy us. At this time, we need the depth of the church's sacramental life and rituals of order to face life's deeper sufferings and mystery. In contrast to a rich Wesleyan view of mediated grace sacramental, demystification within the contemporary evangelical church continues to squander vibrant spiritual resources. And let me illustrate what I mean here by demystification. And I'm going to skip a couple of pages, but I'm just going to skip to an illustration from a practical ministry class that I taught for senior religion majors. One of the main themes in the course is the sacraments and certain pastoral practices we might consider sacramental, like marrying or burying. And these were students that were going to go right out into the church. They'd had no experience with doing a marriage or a baptism, and they wanted to give them a little praxis theology. The majority of the students have grown up in low church evangelical settings. Theology differs little between Free Methodists, Wesleyan, or Nazarene students and the generic non-denominational Baptistic types. One of the first topics we wrestle with is baptism, and it's not surprising to discover that most students hold a relatively low view of this primary sacrament. That is, baptism for them basically signifies a declaration of public faith, without much divine activity or mystery involved, without really much covenant even. And while it may be a sign, it doesn't matter much who performs the baptism, where or how. So it's swimming pools or skydiving baptism with a squirt gun. What counts is the experience of the believer, the sincerity of his or her heart. Baptism then, as a contractual, communal, but almost civic rite, has become almost totally demystified in this picture. How fascinating, therefore, to notice a further domino effect where Holy Communion and other sacred rituals take on rather ordinary and commonplace significance, right? For example, ordination and an event we tend to care more about, marriage. The class actually noticed that anything seems to be allowable today when it comes to getting married. The couple decides what they're going to do, not the church. There is no liturgy. Any time, any place will do, with any old words created for the occasion by almost anyone under any circumstances. But then the lurking fear creeps in that somehow not taking the ceremony seriously somehow may contribute to our not taking the vows very sacredly. Same could be said of funerals. What's happened to funerals? Tom Long's got a great book on this, the history of what's happened with a contemporary funeral. When we cease to allow ourselves to be formed spiritually by custom, symbol, metaphor, and meaningful liturgy, there is, according to Maggie Ross, quote, a gradual erosion of the ability to engage these ways of knowing, the use of paradox, symbol, and gesture that have come down to us from the earliest days. It is precisely this deeper language of mystery we need in the second half of life. It is as if we are losing one of our senses, the sense of the liturgical, a spiritual way of knowing that lay at the heart of religious experience and formation in the biblical world and the early church, and in the practiced, enacted Christianity of the Wesleyan movement. Howard Snyder sums up the journey of the Free Methodist Church over the last 50 years in quite an expose here in this block quote. As a denomination, Free Methodism cast about for definitions of success to replace its historic sense of mission. Options partially embraced from time to time included church growth, charismatic leadership and styles, business models such as management by objective, megachurch models, vineyard approaches, seeker sensitivity, and the purpose-driven church. The Free Methodist quest sketched here by Snyder is representative of many Wesleyan evangelical denominations and many non-denominational churches in our country, and Mainline certainly is not exempt from that. I'm going to skip a couple pages, page 23. We're talking about market realities, and that is a reality, but week by week we've got Americans investing millions of dollars to reinvent worship. Every week. If you haven't read Renovation of the Heart by Carlson and Lucan, you should read that. It's very eye-opening. Never mind the lectionary or the Christian calendar or collects employed for centuries, we barely include the scriptures in our services and normally treat Eucharist as an add-on. It's not simply a matter of replacing our focus on the mission of the church with a focus on its nature. We need both. What emerging adults long for is spirit-empowered means of grace for the purpose of healing our souls toward the wholeness of holiness. Legitimate spiritual formation always moves us toward this end of freeing us to become our best selves in Christ. Yet without a vigorous sacramental life, the divine presence in Word and Eucharist, the divine power through Spirit and holy living, Wesleyans have precious little to bring to the table that is unique. What in fact do most churches give people today not offered by community groups like the Lions Club? What do Christian colleges provide spiritually that young people have not already gotten 3 years in a row at summer camp? What do we offer in our educational institutions and churches for people who are desperately hungry for God? If we lack sacramental depth and mystery, those things into which angels long to look, if there is not much that is supernaturally distinctive about the church, no wonder folks don't care much for our avocados. Tom Oden, a long time ago, put it this way: if sacrament is of human institution and not God's own means of grace, then we in ministry need make no fuss about it. If the sacraments are essentially social inventions or customs, that is, we've got a functional view, a sociological functional view of what sacraments are, then the benefits they confer must be human, not divine benefits. The moment that pastoral reasoning grants the decisive point that sacraments are of human invention, then what else remains to be said theologically? No plausible sacramental doctrine can be retrieved from that point on. And folks, that is the situation in many of our churches. Perhaps a demystified church is just a fancy name for a club. Perhaps a university disconnected from the life of the church shouldn't bother calling itself a Christian school. Could it be that God is calling us to reconstitute the sacred and sacramental life in our churches and schools, to learn once again how to apply what Wesley called the means of grace? And you know, they varied for Wesley. Billy Abraham describes the purpose of the means of grace as employed by the church in the patristic period as working to, quote, reconnect human agents with their divine source and origin. They are akin to medicine, explains Abraham, designed to heal and restore human flourishing. They are akin to various exercises appointed to reorient the whole of human existence to its proper goal. Should not Wesleyan universities work hand in hand with churches toward that formational goal? And I've got a set of 7 questions there, possibly worth pursuing, that you can look at. So thank you very much.